in traditional style. Aloha! Be able to bring to you the first part of the cable workshop for the PTC. Um, and as far as I'm concerned, long live submarine cables. That's the way I look at it. They've been around for many, many years. I'm told about 97% of the world's traffic is carried on submarine cables, and I don't think anyone's making a mistake that submarine cables in the world today are key to our future. Um, I'm privileged enough to have a wonderful group of people up here for us today. Our intention in the first part of the workshop is to give you the opportunity to correct us if we're wrong, and also to actually just have a look around for the last 12 months of what's been going on in different parts of the world, and also to have a little bit of an insight into the legal and the regulatory aspects, the operational aspects, and of course some new things that are surfacing amongst us. So I'm not going to pretend to take too much time. I'm going to kick off as fast as I can and introduce to you the panel. I don't intend necessarily to have questions at the moment, but you can see on the screen our wonderful group of people. First of all, we got Hugh McGarry. He's the principal for Garnet Consulting. We've got Mike Rieger, who many of us have known and worked with over the years. Mike's the VP of Sales, Fourth TE Subcom, based out of the United States. We have Keith Schofield, who is the General Manager of ICPC, actually. So please excuse that on the screen. Next we have Dean Viverka, well, I would have to say a very good friend and an expert in the operational aspects of submarine cable. I don't think you'll find in the industry someone with too much more skill operationally. Likewise for Kent Bressy, who many of us have known for many, many years. Absolute expert in the legal and regulatory aspects of submarine cable, Harris, Woosher and Grannis. And at the end, I have the pleasure of meeting Nicole, who has been working with the Suboptic and the ICPC for some time, who's going to show us some very exciting developments, something that has been needed for a long time, and thanks to the support that she's been getting, we're actually going to benefit greatly from the work that she's doing. So on the way through, first up we're going to have Hugh, who's going to give us, we're going to do three regional updates. We're going to go through the Asia Pacific, we're going to go through Europe, Middle East, Africa, and we're going to go into the Atlantic. Now, if your cable is not shown or talked about, it's not because we don't love you, but you do have an opportunity to say, oh, look, there's just one more that I'd just like a correction, or if there is a correction you'd like to throw in, this is not meant to be any type of replacement for the wonderful work our friends in Telegeography do, or Subtel Forum, or anything like that. It's just a little bit of a lead in. And so we've got from now until 10:30 to get through this wonderful presentation series. So after that, you're going to need a cup of coffee, at which stage we'll lead over to Elaine and her crew, and then run into part two of the workshop. So thank you again for attending. I'm going to pass straight over to Hugh McGarry.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And Paul's already made most of my apologies for me. I volunteered to do an update. Did I volunteer an update on the Pacific, which is where I spend most of my time? That seems to have segued into Asia Pacific, which is far more daunting in terms of the number of systems there. What I'd like to cover in 10 minutes, perhaps a little longer, is the following: what's been completed and upgraded, what's planned, and that's a long list. And again, I'm not an expert on any of those areas, and there are people who list systems and keep them up to date, and I hope some of them are in the audience who can help me answer any questions. Then perhaps briefly on Asia and the Pacific, because there are differences, and I thought that might be interesting. Some of them are obvious, perhaps some less so. The Pacific experience, what's been happening in the Pacific, which I had prepared already, growth drivers, and then other technologies. Are they competitive or are they complementary? And some of that's been covered in depth in later sessions during this conference. And then some final thoughts. So completed and upgraded in Southeast Asia, and there's an N at the end that shouldn't be there. To the best of my knowledge, SJC, Singapore, Japan, as system was upgraded. That's a consortium. I don't intend to add a lot more to these lists than just to walk through them and throw them up for you. I guess what's significant, or compared to the next slide, is that the amount of systems that were upgraded and completed is quite short. Inevitably, the systems that are planned is a lot longer. If there are any corrections to that, very happy for people who are closer to them to comment as we go along or to correct me. Some are private and some are, there is a legend there, consortium or private. And then the much longer list, which it would be impossible to go through in detail. Perhaps just a couple of comments there. I have another indicator of the type of system they are in terms of how they're put together, called D+, and that means what I've termed development plus, because in the case, and there's just a few of them, Palau, Yap, Guam, SOC, the Solomon Islands Cable, and Samoa, another planned system. Those are systems that are being substantially assisted by development funds, either grants or concessional loans or a mixture of. I think the other thing of note in the list, if it is correct, there are a couple of corrections, by the way. Late last night I was looking up some detail, and Hawaii is actually 2017 according to their website for an RFS date. And I think NCP is also 2017, I found. Of the planned systems, I estimated that 40% have slipped RFS dates. That's probably not surprising to those of us in the industry, but somebody asked me why that is. It may be pretty obvious that it's funding. It isn't always, actually, in some of the smaller systems, particularly the ones that I've been involved in. And some have slipped, as you would be aware, by much more than just a year. So Asia and the Pacific, and I know I've worked extensively in Asia, but not in the cable industry. And the Pacific I've got to know much better over the last 5 years. Clearly countries and populations are different. So the attraction for normal commercial cable systems are less. They're not on most people's radar. Scattered small island nations, so small populations, big distances, and smaller, relatively speaking, capacity needs. But apart from the aspirations of bodies like the United Nations and the Broadband Commission and the development banks to try and bridge the digital divide, which is what they're trying to do with supporting cables or infrastructure for the smaller islands and less developed nations, they're increasingly have to be on. They do need to be connected to the internet. And we'll see some of those statistics that show what the appetite is. So the projects inevitably are smaller, and they have different funding needs, and there are different options. I think it's fair to say that most and I'm not talking trans-Pacific large systems, but most intra-Pacific systems where a small island such as Solomon Islands needs to connect to the World Wide Web. Those, it's difficult for them to happen on a purely commercial basis with commercial debt. They do largely need the help of development funds, and those are available. I mean, institutions like ADB and World Bank and others have recognized the need for ICT penetration. This need to acknowledge the continued work of Hibbard Consulting and John in keeping this up to date. This is just something to illustrate the kind of growth that we've seen in the Pacific, and again, intra-Pacific systems. I won't spend too much time on it, but the couple of the takeaways are that you get massive growth due to suppressed demand in the first year, in fact, at RFS. Usually it has been a doubling of capacity as soon as you turn that on, and then considerable growth thereafter. The right-hand column shows the compound annual growth rate on average, and there's a couple of comments I'd make on that. The bottom right-hand corner shows an average growth rate of 39%, and that's because in the case of PPC', or the routing, particularly Madang, Guam, there's a BU that lands in Madang that was not accessible for quite a while. And when that came on stream relatively recently, coincident with the regulation of broadband, so it no longer was a monopoly, the demand soared. So you're looking at 182%. So that was such a distorting number that for the purposes of using this chart, when you're explaining to, say, commercial lenders that this demand actually does happen, because usually they don't believe you, then that would bring it up to about 60% compound annual growth rate. And bear in mind that much of this growth has been achieved before 3G, particularly 3G was up and running in some of these countries. In some places it's been there for a couple of years, excuse me, but the rollout has been fairly slow and certainly followed the arrival of cables in most cases. So there's no reason why the growth should be slowing down at all. What are the drivers? And again, clearly everyone knows that it's increased mobile 3, 4G. This applies to obviously Asia as well as the Pacific. The falling cost of smart devices that is happening, and particularly some of the devices coming out of China, they target small, less developed countries. The lower cost of broadband, and that's not just cable systems. We've seen O3B and its penetration around the Pacific particularly provide an impetus to that growth by providing, albeit higher latency than cables, and an excellent stimulus to demand. Lower IP transit costs generally, so it's costing less for usage, and there's just appetite. I mean, we all know what that is. There's just an insatiable demand, even amongst countries where they have low GDP. The average spend, there's another slide which I don't have, but another presentation which shows the amount of monthly income that people spend on IT is huge compared to developed countries, but they will spend it. The other thing that a growth driver that's just starting to happen is some tax reform in some countries, smaller countries, where people are paying heavy import duties on mobile devices and then paying sales tax on things. There's a more enlightened view emerging, albeit slowly. So other technologies, competitive or complementary, medium Earth orbit satellites, O3B. I have no hesitation in my experience over the last couple of years in saying it's complementary. Occasionally, I don't know if there's anybody from O3B here, but initially there was a little bit of, well, it's them and us. It isn't. O3B has done a great job of providing improved connectivity, and in some cases grooming the market for submarine cable systems that were going to come along. And in some places where a submarine cable system with or without concessional funding, is never really justified. They will continue to do a good job. We have, for example, Pacific, that's still not launched, but that question has come up as well by people who are looking to fund projects. Oh, is this going to erode the need for a cable system? Again, I don't think so. I think it's complementary. It's even complementary to O3B. It's a thinner line. It's a distribution tool, I think, for some of the smaller islands, particularly where terrain is challenging, such as PNG and Solomon Islands. Then more recently, of course, here we go again with low Earth orbit, OneWeb. I read as recently as yesterday and the day before, there are 2 competing systems planning to get going. One from our friend, the founder of O3B, and Elon Musk and the Tesla car. They both seem and with SpaceX, they both seem very serious about it. Time will tell. Is there a need for 2 of these? Again, 648 satellites in a low Earth orbit. I don't know enough about it. There's not enough available to know what kind of trunking it may or may not be able to do. I think it's more about reaching smaller pipes to individuals. I did have another line which was recovered cables, but upon reflection, there's a completely separate section on that, and it's not a competing technology anyway. It's the same technology, so I took it off. And final thoughts. How am I doing?
Great timing, my
friend. I think just things that I've noticed over 5 years, restoration needs are changing, and certainly in the submarine cable industry, there used to be rules of thumb as to how much you would restore, typically via geostationary satellite, in the event of a cable break, which might take 2 weeks to fix. So I'm talking about more isolated places rather than large continents. I'm talking about the middle of the Pacific rather than the rim. It's the always on again, that you might have restored 15-20% of your capacity, prioritize on what used to be called leased circuits, and voice didn't take too much anyway, and people would put up with a lower grade of service for a while. That's not really working anymore. We have an increasing reliance on internet, as everybody knows, and that's equally important in some, and perhaps even more important in some of the smaller, more isolated countries. So you're looking for larger capacities, and I think that is for restoration, resiliency, and I think that's going to drive the need, even in the Pacific and intra-Pacific, for where it makes any kind of sense and is possible to have additional cable systems. The demand itself will probably never justify it in many of these countries, but the need for restoration does. So I think over the next few years we will see more meshing and interconnection happening. And then lastly, domestic cable systems in certain places are certainly needed. I know there's some, in the case of Tonga, is looking at a domestic system to pull in some of the more remote islands of Hapai. There's long been talked about and proposed festoons for northern PNG, and perhaps linking into Indonesia for restoration. Shorter domestic systems, and the same thing I think will apply to places like the Solomon Islands, where they are very close to PNG for mutual resiliency. And that is it. I didn't get any challenges on the list and the dates. I'm really surprised. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Hugh. Next up we have young Mike Rieger. Hopefully most of you are familiar with Mike. Down, 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 there.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. As Paul said, I'm Mike Rieger. Thank you, Paul, for inviting me on your panel. Paul's asked me to talk about, as you can see here, India, Middle East, and the developments that have occurred over the last 12 months and 24 months. So I'll take you through a walk on that. Walk through a similar format as Hugh. Talk about the usage drivers, the technology drivers. We'll take a look at on the routes, what's happening on the routes, try and put some logic together as to why, extrapolating from what we see as far as being built and what's being planned to be built off of these systems as we go forward. We'll talk a little bit about questions for the future from what's being done and what's being considered. In the Middle East and Africa, India, we had several large developments over the last 12 months, projects that principally ran east to west and provided a continuation of the builds on the core route, the backbone route, from the Singapore corridor to the EU. Two principal large builds were AAE and Simuwi 5. As you can see, AAE 1, so the first of many, we hope, and Simuwi 5 was also built, came into force this year. Probably significant in that both were extremely large builds, both serve a very similar route, a different set of buyers, and provided connectivity along that Indian Ocean corridor to the nations of the Middle East, the GCC, and coming up with fairly similar landings in the EU. So we'll talk about each one independently as we go in and look a little bit more at the details of each to kind of see how they compare and contrast. But also, as you can see, Africa had several cables. It had an extension of the ACE project, probably called Segment 5, coming down. Providing connectivity up to the EU, as well as a festoon for Libya, providing connectivity there. So it was a fairly busy period for this region, with a spread of 16 systems, approximately 53,000 kilometers of cable. And we also saw a significant uptake in the size of the cross-sectional capacity of these fibers, right? We are now talking about 10 plus terabits. So everyone can appreciate this is what's in the public domain. The specific details of each system are not going to be up here, but so we'll talk a little bit in generality. But what's key here, as you can see, it continues to be a route in which companies put a lot of money. They put a lot of investment into this route, and through the designs of the systems that they built, you can see through the fiber mapping and the DLS structure that not only is it serving to provide the trunk backbone connecting east and west, but there's also quite a bit of structure to provide interconnectivity between the nations of the Middle East, India, and the EU. Also on here, you see we have a continuation of the trans-Egyptian issue. Right? We're transiting Egypt terrestrially on both of these. Simuwi and AAE1. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into this, about the alternatives to that, as there's a lot of talk about just how valid is that and how valuable is that option for customers to look at alternatives to going a terrestrial route through Egypt. So just some drivers, looking at sources of what's driving it. Right, we're looking at obviously the internet and content that's being provided on the internet. Right, as we've all come to PTC over the last decades, we've seen a shift from voice to data to now we're talking about app to app, and we're talking about data center to data center. Something that's very apparent if you travel through the Middle East these days is you see the construction of large data centers. Right, several new entrants, several competitors in that space building out their infrastructure, building out their products that they're offering in that space, offering throughout that space, projecting into Northeast Africa and down the east coast of Africa. You go into places like Saudi, Oman, you see the construction of data centers by these players. And these players are buying the infrastructure complements of the network capacity in chunks of terabits or partial fiber pairs to provide the connectivity for those data centers. Not just simple STMs, but rather looking at whole chunks of fiber pairs, and that they can then operate that in a network topology that allows them both the redundancy and the flexibility on technology to upgrade those fiber pairs with the transponders, the terminal gear, and the usage that they demand from the data centers, where you have a much more dynamic flow of information back and forth to the data center, where you're much more subject to and much more sensitive to data blocking and the like, because these data centers are serving large areas of the region. Okay. We then look at these various statistics just put up here to kind of say what is driving it. But really, if you look at the underserved connectivity and you look at the underserved quantity of humans there that are connecting up with mobile devices and now have the volume of data that they're each going to these mobile devices, the demand is tremendous. And so we're seeing, as I said, a creation of infrastructure in region as opposed to prior models where you had infrastructure external to the region and it was trunking in, where you now see the whole ecosystem being created in that region and projecting out India and the east of Africa. Okay, what are we seeing from a driver, technology driver? Right? If you look around the room here, right? If I've been coming here a long time, grayed many a hair, lost many a hair, right? It was the incumbent carriers, right? The incumbent carriers, the country's flag carriers. That's who would be sitting in this room. But we actually have people standing outside the room now. So good job, Paul, advertising. But who's sitting in the room, right? If you look at from a consumption perspective, it's moved from just the flag carriers to the competitive carriers to the mobile providers, but it's also the content players, the data center operators, and the region representatives themselves, all looking to how they're going to build out this infrastructure. And on the technology side, where it was once the domain of just the likes of Alcatel, Subcom, NEC, we now have the upgrade players that are here because they're seeing the desire to upgrade these networks at ever larger chunks of capacity and ever larger flexibility in their technology. So the ecosystem is really merging with the terrestrial topology and creating a much more fluid environment. So what we're seeing, Subcom, in this region over the past 12 months is really an adaptation of, adoption rather, of the coherent transponders in increments of 100G, fiber pairs that are fiber characteristics rather that's being set up to not only work with the current technology of 100G, but to look forward to 400G and beyond, to be able to map fibers not just in a simple DLS model, but also to map it in how people are buying fiber pairs and partial fiber pairs or operating in partial fiber pairs, spectrum blocks that are being sold to large consumers. So you're moving away from, from the older days of an E1 to a STEM 1 to a 64 to a couple waves to now looking at people looking to the future to how they're going to manage blocks of spectrum. And that's what we see happening, not only just in this region, but throughout the world. We also see in terms of, as I mentioned with the spectral blocks, we also see people consuming in terms of terabytes, right? So I'm sure through upgrade discussions here and in other sessions that'll occur this week, people are looking at consuming massive amounts of capacity at the terabit level. And so that is a reality for Subcom in how we're dealing with those large volumes. To be a little more cautious of my time, but from a flexibility perspective, where it hadn't been adopted in the past, interestingly enough, ROADM, was because of commercial issues inside the construction maintenance agreement. Now we see OADMs being sought out because they give flexibility to customers. They give that dynamic capability for this massive investment in the water. And so the ROADM gives them the ability to change that based on where they're seeing success and seeing failure based on their business models. Talked a little bit already about those, but down the bottom here is we also have an agnostic situation with companies of who is the upgrade supplier, or what type of upgrade is going to be done, or what are the upgrade suppliers in the plural. How are we mixing different vendors, right? People don't want to be bound to perhaps one vendor for an upgrade based on the fact that the consortium wants that. They want to have control of their own destiny in how they upgrade and when they upgrade. So let's quickly talk a little bit about route diversity. One of the obvious things in this region is we continue to have the east-west connectivity between Asia and EU on this route. There's been talk about Arctic routes, there's been talk about other routes, but this continues to be the main path, and the main path continues to go through Egypt. There are all alternatives being discussed about going down as far as South Africa and coming back up. That poses obviously bandwidth issues and latency issues. Then there are many geopolitical issues of taking a terrestrial route. At any given day, another route may have its own political consequences and its own political turmoil. From the on the east coast, on the east side in Asia, you have architectures now that are not necessarily terminating in Singapore. You have architectures that terminate short of Singapore. You have routes that are crossing from Myanmar to China terrestrially. You have AAE landing short of Singapore. So you have a change in the dynamic on the eastern end of the route, that there's more diversity, that there's more flexibility, and that there's newer players coming to the market that can bring you that capability. So let me move along here. We have new players that have come in some of the cables, not necessarily new to cables, but new roles, landing parties outside of their home country, bigger positions in cables looking to expand in the region. We also have, by using these cables, we have in the Red Sea, we see a dynamic that's changing of a shifting of fluidity in the Red Sea as to where the cables are interconnecting and how that's being provided. We used to see connections inside the Gulf. Now we're seeing with Oman, we're seeing with Djibouti, so there's a dynamic there. So let me quickly, I just have probably 1 minute left to go, is we had AAE1. This is the route of AAE1. Basically, you can see the comments I made earlier about stopping short of Singapore and providing connectivity all the way up to Europe with an Egyptian terrestrial cross. We then have CMUE 5, constructed by ASN and NEC. Also a similar route. I'm sure this will be up for your access later on. Okay. The only other smaller regions, I run myself out of time, so I can't talk to it, but there were smaller builds within the region providing local connectivity. And there's also, as I talked earlier, the west coast of Africa, the extension of Ace Down, and the trans-Atlantic southern route, the first of its type, that is under consideration by Angola Cable. So in the future, we see the changes of some of these routes. We see the changes of some of these landings. Will that continue? Where will that go? So it's definitely evolving as we see the different players come to play and how they'll influence those routes. And then from what will be the buyer profile going forward? Who will be the buyers? Who will be the starters, the anchor tenants, or the project developers? So, Paul?
A lot of people outside. There are a couple of seats scattered through, so you can. I'd say there'd be 5. So the 5 people can definitely come in. It gets better and better, so don't go away. Thank you, Mike. It was enlightening, and it was absolutely, for me, stimulating to hear those developments outside. Now, where am I this time? Where am I? Is that it there? Where's your presentation on here? Just chat for 2. Introduce yourself.
Is this on? Oh, yes, it is. Okay. So I'm going to, in a moment, give you an update on the Atlantic and also provide a few introductory words about the work of the ICPC. Looking out here at the audience, I think we're in a situation where those in the audience are at least as distinguished as those on the panel. So thank you for taking the time to join us here.
I apologise for this. This is not supposed to happen. Where is it? Can anyone see it? ICPC slides. There it is. Yay!
Hey, there we go.
Don't clap, just throw money.
No, that doesn't come up as 10 minutes.
About the ICPC, I'd like to continue the themes that we've had about the regional updates and talk to you a little bit about actually an area which I'm going to define as Atlantic, Americas, and perhaps a little bit of Arctic thrown in as well, so that we don't leave anybody out. And what I'd like to do is just take a quick look with you now as to what's happening in the region. But I guess I'd like to initiate my comments by saying, at last, the Atlantic and Americas region has become, after so many years, an exciting place to do business. So I think what we're now seeing after a period of overbuild, crisis, stress, now we see an amazing confluence of technology, finance and opportunity, which is transforming that region. So let's take a little look at least some of the things that are happening. Once again, I'll echo Paul's earlier comments that if you don't see your system mentioned here, please heckle at will. And of course, I've included a bit of Caribbean here as well. So we see systems like PCCS well underway, and developments as far afield as Colombia, and announcements you've probably seen in the press regarding CBRAS-1. So that's another exciting development in the Americas market there. We also have a Baltic development to look at too. The Sea Lion project being implemented by Cinia, another very exciting project for the region, demonstrating some of the things that we've already heard from Mike about the power of data center customers to drive the marketplace in that region and the content players. We have systems being initiated by Google in the region as well, further exciting developments linking north to south in the Americas region. And of course, not forgetting some areas in the eastern and southern Atlantic, developments in Nigeria, Cameroon as well. SACS we've already heard mentioned, and I included here developments in the Arctic as well. So Rotax and Arctic Fiber. These things are also under consideration, and I wonder whether in 10 years' time we'll be asking ourselves the question, should we have one or two Arctic systems? So just a little thought for you there. Of course, in the North Atlantic, exciting developments too, with Hibernia Express and AE Connect. I know that there are likely, if not already, to be some very interesting announcements in relation to AE Connect. So we not only are we seeing new build, but we're seeing competition in the region. And of course, we have a US defense system as well, and all the other systems that you know about that aren't on this list. So let's develop the themes that we've already had mentioned by our first two speakers. What's influencing the marketplace? What are the trends? What are the drivers? And what are the future? So in the Americas region, well, I guess it's always good to pin an exciting development on a big event. So yes, we have the Rio Olympics coming up, but I think probably most of you in this room know that there are actually much more significant drivers than just a single event that are driving new builds in region. But also, I think it's worth mentioning that increasingly competition is on the way. So we've had a period where you've had capacity being commoditized in the Atlantic Americas region. But if anything, competition is intensifying, which makes it all the more interesting, difficult to make new projects develop and stick in the region. And as we have already heard this morning, content is supremely important in terms of what's driving the network. So the people who are wanting capacity on these systems are increasingly driving the marketplace. In the Atlantic region, well, here we have a very, very interesting mixture. Upgrades forever or new builds? Who knows? But there are some very exciting things happening there in relation to extending the life of undersea cables, developing to the max the amount of capacity that's available on existing cables. And I wonder whether we may look back at this time to actually say, is pricing now beginning to firm up in the Atlantic region? I don't know. Probably you know better than I do, and I guess there's going to be some significant deals struck here at PTC that may answer that question. But all the same, it's very, very interesting to see how the market is developing and changing in terms of the trends. So what's driving the market? Well, we've already heard how important these things are, smartphones driving the marketplace. So now the impact of mobile is having a huge effect in relation to infrastructure, solid infrastructure. And that's now trickling through to the marketplace that we're here discussing today. Also, as we've already heard alluded to, the impact of the flexibility required of rerouting traffic, of having capacity on demand, some of those exciting things are now trickling through into everyday life for the operators as well. And so the way in which systems are being specified, the requirements that have to be met are changing from just build me a cable and string it from A to B. It's now all changing. In the Atlantic region, well, we've all heard it said, latency is very, very important, and so there is that need for speed. But also, there's a need for diversity. People want resilience. They expect their traffic to be reliable, available, and on demand. And so some of these things are driving what may at first seem difficult to justify new builds. Actually, it does make sense if what's very important to you is maintaining the resilience of your network. And so as a result of that, now we are seeing a situation in the Atlantic Americas region where there is increased choice. So looking a little bit more towards the future, well, I guess I've strayed slightly outside of the region, but I don't think it's been mentioned yet. But maybe there's a West Coast cable on the way, up the west coast of the Americas. So that's another potential development there as we begin to cable up the world. And underserved routes get served by cable that can meet the needs of customers in region. And also we see the impact too of a requirement to begin to shorten some of the geographic routes between countries, nations, and intercontinental destinations. And so we've already seen it mentioned and seen it drawn on the map. The low latency route now across the southern Atlantic as a new development. So in the Atlantic, I've already mentioned new builds, and I'm sure there may be others that you can mention too on that particular route. So will we see, as well as private initiatives, a consortium coming together to build on that route also to get capacity at cost? And I think it's probably fair to say that now we're beginning to see the impact of politics determining more about what cables get built, what cables get developed, and what routes are considered. And so one that's been in the news perhaps ever since Angela Merkel had her phone hacked has been, should more traffic bypass the United States? It's not my job here to make an opinion about that, but nevertheless, it's now a consideration which project developers are now thinking about. That will trickle down and influence the routes that get built. And looking, if you indulge me just for a few moments, the impact of smartphones and a phrase I'd like to coin here, the Internet of Everything. We've heard of the Internet of Things. What about the Internet of Everything? Everything connected, a networked world. And so as we look ahead, that's something which we can see as driving the need for capacity. Content, and finally, cybersecurity. This is an area which I think we would do well to focus on in greater detail. Now, we've seen the impact of the release of information, which is either embarrassing or unwanted by those from whom it's been released. So now we ought to be expecting cybersecurity to be an integral part of how we do our jobs every day. So now I'm going to move on and just say a few words, and really what I'm about to say now is to move on to Dean's presentation, who's going to look at some of the more operational aspects of what it is to own and operate cables, and I'm going to let him discuss that. But the International Cable Protection Committee, if you don't already know a little bit about us, do come and have a chat with me or Dean after this session. But the ICPC has been serving, I think since 1959, the common interest across all of the industry. So with over 145 members today, 5 government members included in that number, more than 60 countries represented in the ICPC, and 98% of the world's submarine telecom cables having some form of representation on ICPC, we now have an organization that actually could take the message of the industry to those who need to hear it, whether it be in government, whether it be in other sectors who have an interest in the seabed. And so we do have already an organisation with unparalleled influence. And so if you're not already a member of ICPC, come and have a chat. Find out what we do, find out more about it. And the ICPC is not duplicating the work of others, and so we collaborate very, very strongly with similar organisations such as Suboptic. And what does this mean? What are the things that the ICPC is looking at which actually look into the future and may influence what we're doing here in this room, both in terms of those working in submarine cable systems, those implementing them, those operating them? Well, this graph, the picture is probably a little bit difficult to see, but you have the west coast of the US there and something called the Clarion-Clipperton zone, where you have other legitimate users of the seabed who are able to mine in those regions. So to take polymetallic crusts and ferromanganese material that's available on the seabed, and under the mandate of a UN body, the International Seabed Authority, are able to reserve areas of the seabed and go work on them. So hope they're not working on your cable. So if you want to find out some more about that, have a talk about it, find out what they're doing, where they're working, because it's very, very important that actually those who have an interest in the seabed are actually communicating. And so to that end, we are working with the International Seabed Authority to look at how we integrate the due regard provisions of UNCLOS that reference both industries, both telecoms and also those involved in seabed mining. And just a quick word to say about this: the areas beyond national jurisdiction will be impacted. So if you think, actually, I have a load of hassle getting my cable permitted in, in either the national jurisdiction or the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, actually, no, think about those areas beyond national jurisdiction as well, because that's going to affect you too as you plan your new cables. That's just one area where we're proactively engaging as ICPC. Another one is OSPAR. So here you have the northeastern Atlantic stretching into the Arctic region, which is being influenced in terms of what happens, particularly again in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the ICPC is engaging with OSPAR to understand what the objectives are there in relation to protecting and reserving anything up to 10% of the seabed in that region. So if you're putting a cable in that region, pay attention, because things are happening in that you need to be taking into consideration. Likewise, if you thought in the western North Atlantic you were safe, actually the Sargasso Sea is an area, once again, beyond national jurisdiction, where there is work being done to understand the impact of cables, or in fact the non-impact of cables in that region too. And ICPC is proactively engaging in that too. So, am I out of time? Nearly, okay. I'll speed through the rest. So just to let you know, there are a number of other areas where ICPC is engaging at all times with other users of the seabed, whether it be cable awareness, and we have examples of that in West Africa, where a nascent regional group is maintaining awareness of cables to other users of the seabed and other marine interests in region. We have the ICPC plenary. We have best practice recommendations which are available to the whole industry. We're also very mindful of ensuring that the message about cable being responsible in relation to the environment is being heard by others who need to hear it. We provide to the press an authoritative voice of the industry too. And so overall, we're able to provide awareness to the industry. If you're new to the industry, come and visit our website. If you become a member, you'll have access to 9 gigabytes of information that we have on the website. Some of that must be of interest to you, I'm sure. We're proactively engaging in relation to environmental awareness and being a clear voice of the industry. And so if you want to find out more, come and present, come and exhibit at the ICPC plenary, which is just a couple of months away, or 3 months away, at Le Méridien Cyberport, an iconic location just near Telegraph Bay, with a great history in relation to telecom cables. And you don't need to look at this in detail, but there's a call for papers.
You can't look at it.
I know, don't, so that's fine. And so with that, I'd like to hand over now to Dean. Thank you.
Right. Next up, we have a young Dean, who's I've already blown his trumpet for him, and he's going to blow his own trumpet now. There you go, Errol.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending this session. Always hard to follow Paul with his introductions, but I'll try to live up to it. I see that there's not too many operational people in the room, so hopefully I won't get called up on things. I've called my presentation part 2 because Paul asked me to do an update on the presentation I did last year, but actually I want to talk about a few different things. So this is really part 2 and a follow-on from last year. I'll also be swapping between, I guess, my roles in Southern Cross and also ICPC Vice Chairman, so hopefully I won't trip myself up as I swap hats. Just a brief look back at what I did cover last year. It was more about the physical protection of submarine cables from an operational perspective. We looked at some of the proactive approaches you can take to protect your submarine cables, things like VMS and AIS in terms of vessel and ship identification can be very proactive but also useful in a reactive mode if you have had a cable break. We talked about air and sea patrols, terrestrial patrols, and probably one of the most significant things in the work we've been doing with ICPC is the national legislation and working with government. So trying to create cable protection zones around your submarine cables, etc. So we're not going to talk about any of those things. That was done last year. And most of it was covered under ICPC recommendation number 6, and it talks about industry's best practice in terms of protecting post-installation of cables. There's a few other things within those recommendations. And Keith did mention the work that ICPC is doing in terms of recommendations. We currently have 14 recommendations. There's another 5 being developed as we speak. And a lot of those are to do with interaction with the new industries that are coming along. So alternate energy companies, deep sea mining, as Keith mentioned. And it's really incumbent on the operators to start to use these recommendations, to use them within the industry, to use them with other industries, because they're becoming the de facto standard, if you like, within our industry. And I think Kent's going to talk about some of the work with federal regulators in the US, and the ICPC recommendations are being cited and really upheld and supported by federal regulators, etc. The reason we want these standards to be the industry best practice is really to stop governments having to regulate our industry, and we feel that the industry itself is best at self-regulation. So if you indulge me for a second, I then thought about, well, what has happened in the last year in terms of trying to give an update on operational matters. And I looked to my own organisation and the work I do, and I think probably 2014 was the busiest year we've had in the 15 years history of Southern Cross. I don't think it's any different to any other operator. Southern Cross added another terabit of capacity. We're introducing new technology like flexible grid that's going in at the moment, which is having significant impacts on capacity and potential capacity. Southern Cross is now going from increasing about 85% on its current technology of 8 terabits up to 14 terabits with flexible grid type technologies. I'll talk a bit later about 2030 extension because there's another workshop on that, and I've got a lead in to that for Elaine. But I think too on the client side, it's getting very much more complex in terms of the connectivity and interfaces that we're using. We ran a 100 gig trial point to point from Christchurch in New Zealand last year through to California, and we're now turning up 100 gig client customer services, which is just enormous compared to where we were last year. So what does that all mean? I think for me it means complexity. The level of complexity from an operational level is just increasing 10 and 100-fold. But it's really seamless. I think if you look at our customers and end users, sure, they get the benefit of faster speed and greater capacity, but generally they're unaware of this increasing technical and operational complexity. And they're the things I want to talk about today. What does it boil down to? For me, I think it boils down to software. Everything is now software defined. And the complexity from an operational level is immense. Not only is it new products, it's coupled with the hardware, obviously, but we've heard about the increase in capacity options in terms of 10G, 40G. We've virtually skipped over 40G into 100 super channels and 400 G wavelengths around the corner. On top of that, we're seeing different modulation formats, so moving away from or adding to BPSK, QPSK, 16 QAM. All these things are highly software driven. We've moved away also from just the point-to-point networks of simple SDH and SONET into Ethernet. Mike talked about the extension of systems into data centers. We're now reaching all the way into data centers and POPs. And so connections now occurring at the Ethernet and IP layer, which is adding to the operational overload. And all these can be wrapped up into optical networks, OTN type networks. We've also heard about smartphone applications and other things. So the product offerings to customers are becoming a lot greater as well. Partial rate, bandwidth on demand, mesh restoration, all those things. We're seeing customer portals being developed where people can activate their own capacity from their iPhone. And we had a demonstration, I think, on this very stage last year of that type of things. What does it mean for network operators? I think this is where the hidden complexity comes in, and it's almost seamless to everybody that's not working in that operational world. So I don't blame or criticise people in your organisation, but if you look at the sales and marketing people, finance, they want these things, they want them delivered straight away, but they don't necessarily understand how complex that is to do it. So at the ground level or at the coalface, these challenges are quite large. Software upgrades are becoming sort of the norm now. These have to be managed in maintenance windows, whether you're upgrading an SLTE platform, your digital cross connects, or even your maintenance, your network management software. We spend a lot of time now coordinating and upgrading the networks to cater for the software changes in products. Every time a new product or service type thing is developed, typically involves software upgrading and some partial hardware. This flows down into the workforce. We're investing more and more in training, and probably different training to what the guys in the field used to do. Before it was point-to-point connecting up fibres. Now, because of the connection through the data centres, and we're dealing with direct connection into big routers at 100G level, and there's so much more information now being delivered back to the workers, to the operations centres, in terms of Ethernet performance, IP, and all of that. So the level of training and investment in training has gone up immensely. This, of course, leads to additional process procedures and documentation of that and implementing that and testing those procedures. Again, a draining task. As well as those that run multiple platforms, and Southern Cross does do that. We run 3 SLTE platforms, we run 2 switching platforms, and we integrate all of that up into an operational support system. Again, the old days of just a point-to-point circuit were easily to map and define, and you could bring the alarms up. Now with virtual networks, mesh protection, all of those things are a lot harder to track and port up. So trying to keep your OSSs up to date as well is becoming increasingly difficult. On top of that, we're then getting rid of all the old equipment. So we're decommissioning some of the old legacy 10G equipment, etc. All of these have to be managed as you roll new services in, and working out how you are going to decommission without interrupting existing traffic is quite a tough challenge. All this adds to risk, and I think nowadays this is the fundamental thing that you've got to work from. Everything you do or add to a system has a component of risk. And risk isn't getting easier. We've all done risk management and should be doing risk management with our cable systems, but even at a legislative level, and I'll use Australia and New Zealand as an example, company directors are now being held directly liable and personally liable for any workplace accidents, deaths or injuries. And so you'll find that the directors of a company need to be and should be becoming more involved in a greater level of activity that's occurring at the operational level, because they are now personally liable. And risk doesn't just stop at the workplace level. We have natural catastrophe is increasing, I think, in terms of storm events and other things. We've always known of these, and cable stations are vulnerable because they're typically on the coast and close to water lines. But it just means you now have to have a greater understanding of that and develop business continuity plans a lot better. So I'm going to leave off on those operational parts there and move into something I put up last year, which was the cable ship maintenance zones. And this map here demonstrates two types of maintenance zones that we have, maintenance ship activities that we have, the traditional zone maintenance agreements, and you can see there the likes of NAS and ACMA and MECMA, which are consortium-based maintenance agreements. And they're supported as well by the private maintenance agreements, typically provided by Alcatel, Subcom, eMarine, Orange Marine. And I know Mike had a slide up on there, but he skipped over it. But I had reported last year that the fleet is aging considerably, and there had been no ship builds. We now have two ships being developed, one by Orange Marine and eMarine, is the other in the Gulf. So there is some replacement, but also we're hearing of decommissioning of some of the ship maintenance stocks as well. So it's still not a good position. What I did want to do on this though was show you some work we're doing with the ICPC in looking and using the cooperation of all the zone agreements and the private maintenance agreements to collect a different type of fault data set. In the past, the ICPC has collected data on what causes cable breaks. And we now know that fairly well, and it's been the same for 50 years. It's bottom trawl fishing, it's ship's anchors, there's natural catastrophe. Over the years, those numbers haven't changed. With the help of now the zone agreements and the privates, the ICPC has, for the first time, been able to collect a very comprehensive set of different data points. And we use these now in our discussions with governments and others. And we're looking really now at once you've had the fault, how do you repair the cable as quickly as possible? And there's lots of reasons why things occur. If you look at the graph there from left to right, this is average number of repairs in a year. There's about 200 cable faults a year. Certainly on the far right, you can see China, including Hong Kong, the UK, Indonesia, have quite a high number of average faults. Towards the left-hand side, and I'll just use this as an example for a sec, India only has a few faults. However, if we then map the time to commence repair, the red indicates the transit time to get from the port to the fault location site, but the green is typically the average notification period. Here you can see now India has jumped up. Even though they have a few number of faults, the time taken to actually get permits possibly or other reasons to get out onto a cable site, cable repair ground is significant. The UK, which had quite a number of faults, is now down on the left-hand side. So its mobilisation time is a lot quicker. What's the reason for these? There's a bunch of different categories there. If there's been a prior repair or the ship is already busy and engaged, that could be one reason. The green is what we like to see, no delays or impact to the mobilisation. The ones that are a concern to us are the red, the permitting. And again, if you look at Hong Kong in the middle, India and Indonesia on the right, full of red in terms of the delay that is added through permitting with the various organisations. And we know we have some significant things there. Ideally, if there should be no permit requirements to repair a cable. And that's certainly the case, for example, in Australia and New Zealand, where you just go out and repair your cable. And I probably missed a point if I just step back. The green and yellow on here too is what we're looking at is both the territorial waters, as Keith mentioned, so 12 nautical miles, and out to the EEZ. And there's a bunch in the blue there, which are the high seas. So we're looking at within the territorial seas, yes, a state has some right to control those repairs. But in the EEZ, there should be no requirement for a permit to repair that. We're then able to use some of that data when we go to visit governments and other organisations and demonstrate to them, that some countries, and this is taking a while to pop up the next slide, don't know why, oh, there it is. And when you look at it graphically, this is a very powerful map to show, what the state affairs are within the world in terms of repair. If you look at Australia, no colours because there's no permit delays. Green obviously is good, anything under 5 days. Orange, 5 to 10 is starting to impact. If you take a typical ship repair, cable repair might take 2 to 3 weeks. You start adding another couple of weeks at the front end is not very good. Obviously the red is one slide to go. Obviously the red is in the danger zone, and you can clearly see from India through Indonesia, Southeast Asia and up into China, it's all red, and as most of you know too, that's where most of our cable faults occur. So the ICPC has a lot of work to do in that area. And just to close out on that point, not only ICPC, but we have a lot of regional cable protection committees as well that are very active. Kent's going to talk a bit about NASCA, I think, for the North America zone, and Subsea Cables UK. Both of those very active with governments in trying to solve some of these problems. DKCPC, or the Danish one, predominantly looking after power cable issues at the moment. OSCA is our newest cable protection committee, regional one, which looks after Australia, New Zealand and South Pacific Islands. And I know Bernard Logan, somewhere in the audience, is trying to kick off an African cable protection committee as well. So finally, and I'm on time, or just over, Paul and Elaine have asked me to put up a slide. Again, this is a bit of an indulgent slide on Southern Cross, but the workshop following this after the morning tea break will be looking at reuse of cables and extending life of cables. Southern Cross has now done that, and we believe we're the first ones to extend the commercial life of a system beyond its design life. The math is pretty easy here. We went into service in the year 2000. The design life is 2025. We've now extended that commercially to 2030. I won't go into all the details, but obviously it took about a year for us to consider all of these things. The engineering aspects are obvious. The wet plant being the hardest thing to replace. So looking at cable and hydrogen, nitrogen ingress, fibre aging, repeaters and the laser pump performance, Southern Cross has over 500 repeaters, 6 pumps per repeater. So scouring through 15 years of repeater performance down to every laser was a significant challenge. The dry plant side is fairly easy because that is replaceable. But then you also have to consider the legal side of things. So your existing permits, carrier and landing licenses, any contracts you have with landing parties and cable stations, and your maintenance support contracts, etc. And we worked with both our original supplier and our current other suppliers to ensure that all these things were ticked before we could then offer a commercial solution to our customers. And on that, I thank you.
He always fascinates me. The operational aspects and these aspects of our business, I think, in many times are underrated, and I really appreciate you coming in and sharing all of that with us, Steve. That's wonderful.
It's all secret, can't leave the room.
It's top secret, can't leave. Yeah. Right. Oh dear. One day I'll learn how to use a computer. Kent, over to you, my friend. Everybody know Kent? Make him welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Yet again, we have managed to pack out this room, standing room only, always gratifying for a speaker, and it's great to see lots of familiar faces. I would like to touch briefly on a few regulatory developments over the past year. A lot of these, or most of these, are focused on the United States for a couple of reasons. One, because a lot of the significant developments relate to the U.S. legal and regulatory systems. but also because of their precedent-setting effect. A lot of countries are often looking at what the United States is doing in the area of security or other areas and thinking of perhaps echoing that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the FCC's CISRIC process and developments with cable protection, where we stand with FCC fees, more good news. I know that's been a topic of gloom and doom in the past. Security reviews with Team Telecom, and the status of where things are in terms of licensing timeframes for new systems and for mergers and acquisitions. So first, with the CISRIC, the rather inelegant acronym for the FCC's Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. This is an advisory committee chartered by the FCC, and it advises the FCC chairman on a variety of issues relating to communications, security, reliability, and interoperability issues. For the first time in 2013, the FCC included a working group on submarine cable protection and resilience issues in response to some particular developments in the United States, conflicts with other seabed activities. And I have the pleasure of chairing this working group on submarine cable protection and work with a number of people in the room who've made big contributions to the working group. The impetus of this really started with conflicts with offshore energy development and with sand dredging and beach replenishment projects. There was initially, it's now been canceled, but a tidal energy project in Puget Sound that was to be installed directly adjacent to the PC'15 system in Admiralty Inlet. There have now been two separate projects proposed in the Central California coast region near Morro Bay for wave parks to be built by the U.S. energy company Dynegy, proposed to be constructed directly over 4 trans-Pacific systems, including Southern Cross, AHE, and Japan US. On the East Coast, we've seen conflicts, particularly after Hurricane Katrina, with proposals by local governments or by the Army Corps of Engineers itself to conduct sand dredging and beach replenishment directly over or adjacent to installed submarine cables. And in all of these cases, there's been a lack of understanding or awareness on the part of other federal, state, and local regulators, and ignorance in the energy industry. And in fact, sometimes a real hostility to the cable industry itself. The view of the Army Corps initially with a beach replenishment project in New Jersey was, well, if you're in the way, you'll have to move your cables, which indicates that we've got a lot of work to do in this area. And so the working group includes about 25 members, and it includes representatives of industry, capacity customers, other government regulators and agencies, everything from the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System to the 2 key energy regulators that are the source of some of these conflicts. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is the U.S. regulator for offshore wind projects, in addition to oil and gas projects in the US EEZ, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the regulator for tidal energy and wave energy projects. In December 2014, we presented our first report to the FCC on spatial separation. There had been a lot of ignorance and misunderstanding on the part of other Distances. More than anything else, we're pushing for a regime which is reflected in the ICPC recommendations that both Keith and Dean touched on, that there needs to be coordination at the earliest possible stage with industries and regulators talking with each other. But in the absence of that, there should be a default rule that these facilities and projects should be separated from each other. And that helps to drive the discussions as well if there's a desire to have things that are projects that are adjacent to each other located more closely. So the report recommends a default separation distance in both shallow and deeper waters, again drawing on ICPC recommendations and also some of those of Subsea Cables UK. The United Kingdom has much more experience in addressing seabed conflicts between undersea cables and offshore wind projects. And again, we've highlighted these other recommendations, which we have styled as standards or default rules, even though ICPC in particular does not call them that. We also called for adoption of greater legal penalties for cable damage. The U.S. statutory penalties for cable damage haven't been updated in more than 100 years. They don't deter any activity whatsoever. And again, the focus on coordination and consultation. If I could skip to the next subject, some more good news on the subject of FCC regulatory fees, a subject that used to cause quite a bit of dread in this industry. As some of you might recall, since 2009, we now have a flat per system fee that is payable for the system, even if there are multiple owners each year, and those fees continue to go down. They decreased by 15%. The North American Submarine Cable Association, NASCA, has been advocating on this consistently to help drive the fees down. And I think we finally have buy-in from the FCC that the fees still need to decrease further in future years. So we'll need to be vigilant on that, but this is no longer the problem that it was in the past. But there are still some particular remaining challenges, particularly in the area of security with Team Telecom reviews. As I think some of you know, the United States, for both new submarine cable systems and acquisitions of existing systems, if the system has a foreign landing or foreign ownership, it is subject to security review by the Departments of Justice, Homeland Security, and Defense, nicknamed Team Telecom. And this process has evolved over the past 10 years, but at the present, the most contentious or involved reviews have really focused on issues of Chinese equity or ownership or voting control, Chinese origin equipment and software, and any kind of indirect or direct ownership by foreign governments or militaries. And these have affected both transactions and applications for new cable landing licenses, they also impact, as you'll see with some of the licensing times at the very end, customers who need carrier licenses, 214 authorizations to provide services into the United States. So there is the prospect of reform. The FCC in particular, under its current chairman, has essentially had it with the Team Telecom process wrecking a lot of the FCC's licensing process, and has been pushing for reform, working with other U.S. federal agencies. And the FCC is now on its, I believe, fourth iteration of a set of reform proposals, which would standardize the questionnaires that parties receive and ensure that they comply with other federal laws. It would establish general timelines for reviews and create a process where if the Team Telecom agencies wanted more time to conduct reviews, that they would have to make a request on the record in the FCC's proceedings, and other parties, including the applicants, would have the option of opposing that. So this would create significantly more transparency than we have right now. But we're not there yet. The Team Telecom agencies have not agreed to move forward with this set of proposals yet, although they're being pressured to do so. So I remain hopeful that we're going to see some of these reforms in the near future, but we're not there yet. Just briefly, another issue that arose in litigation with a somewhat similar security review process. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States reviews acquisitions of existing U.S. businesses in any economic sector, so it's not limited to the telecom sector, but it has to be an existing business, an acquisition that would result in foreign control. And in a case involving an acquisition of a U.S. wind farm by a Chinese investor, it resulted in considerable litigation and a recent U.S. court decision finding that the CFIUS has to provide parties in a review with unclassified information on which they base their decision, including a decision to block an investment, and an opportunity to rebut that evidence. The decision was specific to the CFIUS process, but the CFIUS process is very similar in some ways and involves some of the same agencies as the Team Telecom process. And so it remains to be seen whether or not this will provide parties with an opportunity to challenge what Team Telecom does and seek to learn of unclassified evidence and have an opportunity to rebut that in order to move things along in the Team Telecom process or achieve more favorable conditions for market entry. I'm going to conclude just with a few slides, and if you're interested, I'm happy to, if you give me a business card afterwards, to email these around, because there's a lot of data here. But I have three slides that show recent U.S. licensing times for new undersea cable systems, for mergers and acquisitions involving undersea cable assets, and also for carrier licenses. And you'll see that the average time for systems with foreign landings or foreign ownership is not decreasing. It can still take up to a year to get through this process. And the delay, although the final action is the FCC's issuance of the license, it's really the Team Telecom process that is the source of the delay. And just to give you two recent ones, Emerald and PCCS was considerable. With mergers and acquisitions, we have a couple of notable pending transactions, others where the submarine cable assets were a small part, such as Level 3 TW Telecom, others where it was principally an undersea cable transaction. Again, the licensing times, the approval times are pretty long. And then finally, we have some data on carrier licenses, customers of a lot of the systems that have been described in different parts of the world, some of whom are consortium members for existing or planned submarine cable systems. And you'll notice that for carriers that are ultimately owned by Chinese or Vietnamese investors or those governments, those applications have been pending for a long time, for years, in fact. And the legality under U.S. trade obligations, WTO commitments, is questionable. But that's an issue for those governments and those carriers to take up. So still a lot of work to do in terms of team telecom reform. We're not there yet. So with that, I will finish. Thank you.
All right. We're rocketing through. This will be between you and a cup of tea, but I think you're going to want to stay. You're going to skip? No, you don't need to rush. Just take your time. It's only a cup of tea. If it was a beer, don't worry about that. If it was a beer, it'd be different.
All right, well, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. For the past 5 years, I've been working on a book that will be out this March called The Undersea Network, where I've been researching the submarine cable industry. And I often give hour-long presentations and then end up with the same question. Well, isn't it all going to satellite anyway? So there's obviously a need for cable awareness, but the same old stories about undersea cables aren't working very well. They typically go along the lines of, we connected it, and then the system fades from memory. So as an alternative to this, and hopefully an intervention into the way the public thinks about undersea cables, I've been developing an interactive visualization of the cable network that takes a different form, a game of exploration, a kind of cable tourism, where the user is a signal that has to get across the network. The project is called Surfacing. And I'd just like to take a moment to thank the ICPC and Suboptic for funding this first iteration. Without their support, this would not have been possible. Oh, okay, yes. So just quickly, the structure of surfacing is such that there are 5 different layers. Players must navigate between these layers of information. Each one is a distinct visual environment that foregrounds a different part of the cable network. It's kind of part puzzle, part exploration game. And so now I'm just going to guide you through a tour of the system. Okay.
You should have been doing that before. Faster than
I am. So you'll begin with a splash page that tells you a bit about the cable systems, how important they are, and tells you that you are a signal tasked to traverse the undersea network. Our destination today is Con Dao, a small island off the coast of southern Vietnam. An island with only one short-lived cable connection, a French telegraph cable laid over 100 years ago. So in the game version, you would have a certain number of hops, like a packet, to get across the network, and things like earthquakes would decrease your number of hops, and interconnection agreements would increase your number of hops. But today, you land on a beach on the central California coast. You're in between 2 of the first nodes for internet traffic, 200 miles from the major technology hub of Silicon Valley. This is where the internet enters the United States via undersea cable. But the landscape seems anything but technological. Behind you, an expansive state park wraps around the California coast. Fog covers the ocean, but deters neither surfers nor signals invisibly transiting beneath the beach. So now we're in the place layer. We've moved from an image to the place. Here, there is an array of images of the area, usually non-specific environmental photos, selected to ensure security. So if you click on the node, you can move between the different images of that area. And then you can use you can't really see it here, but there's a zoom in and out like in Google Earth. So you can zoom into that particular image. And from there, you can click on stories that relate that image to other places around the Pacific. So arriving in California, you find the cable marked on a nautical chart on the beach. These squiggly lines are drawn as an attempt to keep boaters off the cable route, but the ICPC had to put up a fight to even get them listed. While most network disruptions are accidental, some suspect that others are deliberate. Before cables came into Morro Bay, there had been a nearby refinery with a pipeline extending out to sea. In order to keep fishermen off the line, the refinery had compensated them. When the refinery closed, fishermen's thoughts drifted to undersea cables. So you can zoom back to the place here and then out to the map layer, where you can see all of the different cable networks drawn from telegeography, but also back to the 1800s. So you travel via the Southern Cross Cable to northern Oregon. Here, you wind inland for over 70 miles through the mountains to a Portland suburb in the heart of Silicon Forest. This area was first granted this nickname in 1981 after Intel set up a research campus there. Yet the seeds of Silicon Forest were planted much earlier. In the 1930s, the U.S. Forest Service Radio Lab was created here, and they developed wireless technologies to track wildfires that spread through the mountains that are now along the cable route. Engineers at the Radio Lab eventually developed two of Portland's most well-known tech companies and set the stage for today's high-tech boom and the influx of undersea cables. So here you might click on a story about critical infrastructure, in which you would learn that cables are critical to a nation's economic and social stability. You can zoom out from here on the unseen zoom bar to themes that are broader forces about things that affect the cable networks. So here you can see how important cables are to security, to national security. So this is kind of a map with the country lines taken out, a data visualization of where these concerns shape the cable system. So you can see they're concentrated on the US West Coast. But as you move around, you can see that other problems are more broadly distributed. Cable laying faces challenges from turbulent ecologies everywhere in the Pacific. So if you were to zoom in on a story about earthquakes, for example, you would learn that earthquakes are rarely the direct source of the cable break. Rather, geological shifts cause undersea landslides that then sever the network. Or you might read about the problems caused by the Hengcheng earthquake in 2006, which was a wake-up call to many about the importance of undersea cable systems. The closest cable station to the epicenter of Japan's 2011 earthquake, Kitabaraki, was severed from both the US and Asian networks. Following the disruption, the cable company announced the construction of a new tsunami-resistant station that will stand 90 feet above sea level. Submarine destruction turned into opportunity for network innovation. But this has not been the way that we imagine the internet. Usually we see a network diagram, a cable map, with lines and nodes. The links between two locations in this network diagram in network theory is termed an edge. Cables are simple lines between 2 points. But this project is an attempt to dredge up the vast narrative potential in the environments that are hidden behind these lines. And if we changed the way that we saw these systems, we would not be surprised that the deep ocean is usually the safest part of the cable route. The complex part comes when one moves ashore into the inhabited coastal zone. And finally, we arrive at the shores of Kandao, where networks once carried signals about the torture of political prisoners, the prisoners of the French held during the colonial era, and later wireless signals about the North Vietnamese prisoners of the Americans. Prisons that have now been remade as homes and as historical memorials celebrating the overthrow of former colonizers, a site that seems so far from, yet is intimately connected to, via undersea networks and their shared histories, our starting point in California, as well as many others around the Pacific, whether the aftermath of Fukushima, the development of Fiji and Papua New Guinea, or the use of scientific cables in Canada. These are stories that are yet to be told. And so I'm now in the process of soliciting test users for feedback on the system, and I welcome you to drop your card with me if you would like to be involved in that. Thank you.
Well, that's a great way to say long live submarine cables. So I can't thank the panel enough, so could we just give them all? For all of you attending, please enjoy a break, a cup of tea, a cup of piece of to eat, and Elaine will be back. Elaine at 11 a.m. So please enjoy yourselves. Don't go away. There's best yet to come.
we can mention. Thursday. Yes. Yeah, we typically.